We are starting a brand new series this morning, a 5-week series. Take a look at your bulletin if you have it in threads, just so you see how to print this word, but it's Communitas. So like community, but an AS on the end, Communitas. And it's our series, wonderful series. Did you all enjoy the Walking Dead series, by the way? Really, really good. Walking Dead, Alive to Christ, Dead to Ourselves, all that's online on our Vimeo page, YouTube channel, all that, if you missed it. But a great series wrapped up last week. Again, 5 weeks on Communitas this week. And we'll be talking about this concept this morning. Let me set the stage for the next 4 weeks as we go into this new series. And to begin then, I want to start with 3, in a sense, random thoughts, put them all together for you. And we're going to begin this morning in Luke chapter 24. So if you have your Bible, and I hope that you do, turn to Luke chapter 24 as we kick off Communitas here, a 5-week series at Mosaic Church of Central Arkansas. Now again, 3 random thoughts. I'll weave them together by the time I finish the third thought. But beginning with the first, here in Luke chapter 24, I want to point out to you something from the familiar account of Christ's encounter with 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. You've probably heard this story before. Those of you who are Christ-centered Christians, grew up in a church, whatever, the story of Christ encountering 2 disciples on the Emmaus road. And I won't walk through the entire story, but let me paraphrase or refresh your memory. It's the day of the resurrection. It's Sunday. It's the afternoon. Let's just say it's 3 or 4, maybe 5 at night. We're not told the exact time. But Christ, of course, was crucified, buried on Friday, rose again on Sunday. By Jewish count, that's 3 days and 3 nights. It's a metaphor, euphemism that was used in Judaism. And so Christ is 3 days buried, 3 days now afterwards, he's resurrected. And 2 disciples are leaving Jerusalem, heading back, making a 7-mile journey back to their town, to the town of Emmaus. And of course, as you might imagine, with all the commotion, the excitement, the confusion of the last few days, they're discussing all these things amongst themselves on the road. And it's at that point Christ comes up to them, and he begins to walk with them, the scripture tells us. When he does so, he doesn't reveal to them that he's actually Jesus. He's just a fellow journeyman. And so in a sense, Christ plays dumb. He said, "Hey, what's up? How y'all doing? You mind if I journey with you a little bit?" "No, come on." And so he says, "What are you guys talking about?" And they're like, what's wrong with you, man? Are you the only person in Jerusalem doesn't know what's gone on these last 3 days? So they talk to him about Christ and resurrection. And Christ is like, "What things? I don't know what you're talking about," right? So he draws them out, and they share with him. And you see that, again, in Luke chapter 24, beginning in verse 13. In fact, in verse 19, he asks them, "What things?" And they say to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people." By the way, if we were working on this passage at another angle today, we'd notice how they said he was a prophet, not necessarily the Son of God, right? So trying to figure all this out, who was he? And how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to the sentence of death, crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. We thought he was the Messiah. We thought that he was going to overthrow the Roman government and establish Jerusalem and Judea and the Jews forever. And besides all of this, it's the 3rd day since these things happened. But some women came and amazed us with stories of how his tomb is empty and how they had seen a vision of angels who said that, in fact, he was alive. And some of those who were with us, in fact, went to the tomb and found it just the way they said, but they didn't see him. So all of this, in all of this, these two individuals are explaining to Christ their confusion, all the events, trying to figure it out, what happened. And then Christ says this, verse 25, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?" And check this out, beginning with Moses, verse 27, "And beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures." This is the greatest Christology course ever given in the history of man. You have Jesus Christ himself walking through the entire Old Testament, as it were, to explain and to show that the scriptures pointed to Messiah and all of this was supposed to happen. So, greatest Christology course ever in the history of mankind, Christ himself the teacher. And guess what happens? Nothing. Look at the next verse. It doesn't say anything about people falling down in the streets, disciples, lights coming on, everything, right? Big revival in the land. Nothing happens. they continue on this journey, and eventually, Christ, it says, he kind of says, well, I better be going, I better get home, and all that. And they say, oh, no, please stay with us tonight, stay with us, remain. And so he kind of fakes like, oh, I got to go. They go back and forth. But eventually Christ says, no, I'll stay, fine. And then look what happens. It says there in verse 30, when he says he went in to stay with them, verse 29, and then verse 30. And it came about that when Jesus, he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. What happens? What happens when Christ breaks bread and sits down relationally with these two men? Look at the very next verse. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And you can read on in their reaction, how they're a little prideful and different things. They go back and tell the disciples, and in fact, we did see Jesus. It's really true. He's resurrected. They returned, and look what it says in verse 35 as it finishes this passage. They began to relate their experience as to the other disciples on the road, and how Jesus was recognized them by how? He was recognized by them in, what does it say at the end of verse 35? In the breaking of bread. Isn't it interesting that the teaching that Christ himself delivered to these people failed to produce, as it were, any result until it all came together in the breaking of bread, in the fellowship of the moment, in the relational connection, in the personal connection that Christ made with these two believers. That's the first thought. Keep that in mind. Second random thought, Matthew chapter 28, 28 verses 18 through 20, Acts chapter 1:8, the Great Commission to the church. Now remember, the church is, it's not a building or institution. The church is us, it's people, right? So individually and collectively, not long after this, of course, Matthew has it in 28, Luke has it in Acts chapter 1. But remember, Christ tells his disciples, go into all the world and make disciples of all men. He speaks to the church, he speaks to individuals' mission. He gives us a mission. Go into all the world, make disciples of all men. All, by the way, means all. As Luke points out in Acts chapter 1:8, go begin in your Jerusalem, then Judea, to Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. You are to be a people on mission, to make disciples, make his name known throughout the world for the sake of the gospel. And in calling us both individually and collectively to mission then, what really we learn later on in the New Testament is this, that church is much more than mere attendance on a Sunday morning. The church is to be much more than simply attendance on a Sunday morning. And it's about more than my own comfort and convenience. Did you know that? To live on mission means to willingly sacrifice comfort and convenience for the sake of Christ and his church. And very few Christians in America are willing to live that out. Second random thought. So first, Christ is recognized not in the great expository teaching that he himself delivered, but in the breaking of bread relationally, personally. Second random thought. Christ has called us as a collective and as individuals to live on mission in making his name known, taking the gospel, making disciples of all men. Third random thought comes from Luke again, Acts chapter 2, verse 42. This is after 3,000 folks are saved when Peter preaches his first sermon, and the church is born, as it were, in Jerusalem. And Luke talks about the organization of the church, how they got involved and how they came together in a variety of ways. In Acts chapter 2, verse 42, he breaks it down in four ways. It says, and the believers, the disciples, that is the church, it says that they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayer. Four things. The apostles' teaching. In fact, let me group them a little differently than Luke does. It says that they are continually devoting themselves to four things: teaching and prayer, all right? Then the other two, breaking of bread and fellowship. Y'all with me? Now, let's think about this idea of teaching and prayer. Let's just call that Sunday morning worship, right? Teaching, prayer in the form of praying or in the form of worship, but it's the collective coming together continually every Sunday for the apostles. I'm not an apostle, right? You won't see me in the big limousine with my name apostle on it or whatever. It's not me. You don't have to kiss my ring. But We are here to teach God's word, to lift up our spirits, to pray, to come before and worship. So that, in a sense, is one half of the equation. But what's the other half? Breaking of bread and fellowship. Breaking of bread and fellowship. The relational connection. And why do you think that those two components, if we group the idea and really think about Sunday morning and outside of Sunday morning, teaching and prayer with this idea of breaking bread and fellowship relationally outside these church walls, why is that so important for mission? Well, first is we, the church, that is individuals and collectively, we cannot live or sustain that mission, that calling to make disciples of all men, to fulfill that mission. We can't sustain it apart from authentic relationships of transparency and trust with other believers. We cannot do it. I can't live out and make disciples of all men without you. You can't live it out without me. We need each other. And in order to live on mission, you have to have each other's back. You have to have authentic relationships of transparency and trust. How much relationship is being built right in this moment amongst you? None. You know why? Y'all looking at me. Y'all sit and listen to me. You're all thinking about what I'm saying. You're not interacting with one another. It's important that we're doing this. But remember, Acts 2:42, teaching and prayer. Sure, we're going to do that. But we also need to be mixing it up. Building authentic relationships of transparency and trust. I've never been in the military, but I'm told by folks in the military, like Ross and others that have been a part of our church and through the years, but you know, when you fight in the foxholes, you got to have each other's back. If you're a policeman on the streets, they go out in partners, teams of two, right? You've got to have each other's back. You can't just go out on your own to police society. You can't go into war by yourself. You go in partnership, in team, in collaboration, and you've got to build that relationship of transparency and trust. And it happens, I suppose, over meals or with the people that you sleep with in the barracks. And you get to know relationally, to trust them when you actually go into battle. So why would this be an important component of the early church? Quite simply, we need each other to sustain and fulfill mission, and we need to know one another and build authentic relationships of transparency and trust. And that's not happening on a Sunday morning. That just doesn't happen. That's not what Sunday morning is really all about. Sure, we can make connections that lead to relationships and stuff, but that's not really what this program on Sunday is about in any church, not just ours, right? And not only that, not only do we need those relationships outside of Sunday to sustain mission and to find our fulfillment in calling, but also we can't really recognize Christ with us, Emmanuel, apart from breaking bread. And that's what the account in Luke shows us. You can have all the finest teaching. You can read the books. And think about the American church in general. Man, we got more material. We got more Sunday school curriculum. We got more books and Bible studies, and on it goes. But you know what? What does the church measure? Attendance in the seat on Sunday morning. Of course, I got a little fired up about this morning. I was thinking about this message, so I tweeted, and I just had this thought. Twitter, for me, just captures my thoughts in the moment. I don't care if anybody reads it, you know. But I asked myself the question, what good is thousands in the seats if no one's in the streets? I mean, seriously. And I wish we were thousands of people. I wish thousands of people embrace the mission, the vision of this church. I really do. I'm not against a big church at all. I wish we were a couple thousand people. I really do. And we're not trying to do anything to prevent it. We're just preaching the word and calling out mission. But my point is, that's what the American church measures. People in the seats on Sunday morning. But see, that you shouldn't be, that's not the measure. The measure is impact in the community. It's not attendance on Sunday, it's impact in the community. And that's a lot harder for folks to live out. So my point is, not only can we not sustain mission apart from real relationships of transparency and trust formed outside of Sunday morning, but we will not experience Christ with us apart from breaking of bread, as these two men found out on the Emmaus Road. When we connect relationally, authentically, humbly, and build those types of relationships outside of Sunday morning with each other, we find God in new ways. We learn to trust God in new ways. And then we really get to see what God can do through us. Now, you know the mission of this church. Those are the three random thoughts. Now let me move us towards Communitas, right? the mission from the beginning of this church is to know God and to make him known through the pursuit of unity. Really simple. Hopefully every church in America has that as a mission statement in one way or another, to know God and make him known, right? You see that? That's the worship side, and that's also the expression of mission to the community. To know God and make him known. What's unique about this church, of course, is that we see as a vehicle or a means to that end the pursuit of biblical unity across ethnic, gender, economic lines, right? And that's the way we pursue it. In accordance with Christ's prayer in John 17, patterned after the New Testament church at Antioch, a multi-ethnic, economically diverse expression of God's love for all people in real and tangible ways. And then we said that our vision as a church is to be a healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse church in order to present a credible witness of God's love to all people. A credible witness. That's a key term, right? Because if we simply, in our church, simply talk about God's love for all people, sing songs about God's love people, preach messages about God's love for all people, but we in fact do not express love for all people in our daily life, in our church, you see what I'm saying? We don't have a credible witness. We have rhetoric, not real results. So, to know God and make him known through the pursuit of unity with this vision that the pursuit of unity and our collective relationship with one another beyond ethnic and economic boundaries, etc., will then provide for the world, beginning with our group community, a credible witness that God in fact does love you, that God in fact does love all people, and that at the foot of the cross, it's a level playing field. So how do we work that out? Well, you hear us talk about it all the time, right? To walk, work, and worship God together as one. It's our strategy, as it were. We want to worship God together as one. We want to walk in real community, or we're going to find out this morning, Communitas together as one, the relational side. And then, of course, through those relationships, pursue mission and work for the glory of God out there. Walk, work, worship God together as one, so that others will come to know him as we do. Now, in 10 or 11 years of pursuing this church, you know what I found out? It's a lot easier to talk about that mission and vision and strategy than it is for us to live it out. It's a very noble, and it's a very worthy, and it's a very biblical mission and vision and strategy, but it is extremely difficult in a modern age where the church is typically driven by consumerism. I don't think y'all heard me. I said where the typical church in America, the American church, let me just take it in a general way, is driven by consumerism. And it's about convenience and comfort, not cause, Christ, church, and mission. So we have a worthy and a noble and a very biblical, Christ-centered vision, mission as a church. Difficult, more easily expressed than lived out, right? And I can say that to you, but I want to actually prove it to you this morning, all right? So take a look at some statistics that reveal church growth between 2000 and 2009 in the American church context. What churches grow and what churches decline over the last 10 years, 2000 to 2009. My good friend Dave Olson from the Evangelical Covenant Church mined this research in the study of 200,000 American churches. And here's what the data reveals. First of all, here's percentages, evangelical growth rate based on location. Okay? So if you're in the rural area, if you're in a small town, or look at the far right, if you're in an urban context, those churches do not grow in America. They actually went down in a 10-year period. They actually tend to decline if you're in those kind of situations. But which churches grow? Large town and suburban churches. That's who grows. Next slide. This shows the evangelical growth rate based on median household income. If the median household income in your church is $50,000 or above, boy, those churches grow like crazy. But if the median household income is less than $40,000, down to $30,000, we actually shrink. We go the other way when churches have that kind of economic disparity. Here's another slide. How about growth rate based on education? You see, if you have a college degree, college educated, etc., those churches are going to grow when that's the populace of your church. Churches that don't, they just have a high school or a little bit of college, they go down. They actually decline. In a 10-year period, they went down in attendance. And of course, you know, you got the anomaly at the far end, those folks that go to Harvard and Berkeley and all that, I guess they don't have any time for church, right? But in general, the more you're educated, the higher the education bandwidth, as it were, that church grows. Unless it doesn't. Take a look at this one. This ought to break your heart right here. Evangelical growth rate based on percent of zip code of Anglos or whites in a zip code. The more whites in your zip code and the less minorities, your church grows. And if you've got a high percentage of minorities in your zip code, you actually go down. Churches like that decline in areas like that. In fact, I'll just go off the script for a second. I got to tell you this, that when I started this church, there was a gentleman who moved here from somewhere, I don't know, but he was with a denomination that didn't have a church here in town. And I actually met him. Somehow we met 10, 11 years ago, whatever. And I was starting a church, and he was starting a church. I'd lived in Little Rock for 8 years. And, and so I said to him, we went out to lunch one day, and I said, so tell me about your church and what you're doing. And he did. And I said, so where are you going to plant your church? And he goes, well, wherever, I'm not sure exact location, but I know this. I want to be west of 430. Why do you think he wants to be west of 430? Because of all those stats. Because that's why churches grow. When churches grow, your income gets paid. Do you understand? When churches grow, I make more money. When churches grow, supposedly I have more influence. When churches are big, then people look at me and think, hey, he's the man. I lived in this town 8 years. I was already saying, why are all the churches going west? We ought to be going east. And that's why I started the church here. Now, a few months went by, and this is back in the day of AOL dial-up. Y'all young people don't even know what I'm talking about. And that was technologically advanced, man. I'm sitting in there dialing up, and waiting all that little stuff to come through. So I was all high-tech back in the day with AOL dial-up. And somehow I got on this guy's, like he was doing an email distribution, so I get his email. And one day, about 4 or 5 months into my journey, his journey, I got an email, and it went out to the people that he put on a list, and it said, hey, I need $30,000. We need right away $30,000 for our church to make it and grow and thrive and whatever. And then he broke it down where this $30,000 was going. And you know what it was? It was like, well, we need a projection unit, like that's what's up in the ceilings. We need a projection unit, and we need a computer, and we need to buy software so we can project our lyrics on the screen, so we can have all that. And we need a sound system, and we need lighting, and all the stuff was equipment. Now, how many of you started in this church with us back in the first year or two? I see a bunch of you still here. God bless you, the diehards. We did. Man, we were using an overhead projector like a youth group in the 80s for the first 2 years of this church. I used to come, we'd write the lyrics of the song on a transparency, and you got to understand, when I was at Fellowship, some of you know, I got to design and build a $3.5 million student center just for 7th and 12th grade kids. It's not like I didn't know what that stuff was. $250,000 of lighting and sound in one room, 3 full courts, motorized bleachers, you see, I had all that. And I went back to the 80s with this church and used an overhead projector. You know why? We didn't have any money. And at the same time, I wanted to save money because I didn't know if we could make it. And I realized this back then. I thought, you got to dance with what brung you, bro. Because if I start this church built on that stuff, and that's why people come for that stuff and that environment and that mission, as it were, then all the years later, we're going to have to keep upgrading, keep going. See, we said, we don't want people to come because you got amazing lighting or you got the latest technology. We want people here for the mission and the vision of this church. That's what we want. And so our people, we sat there with the overhead. In fact, when people stood up, you couldn't see over their heads, so we had to put it on a table. It's all shaky. We duct taped the legs down. 2 years of this. We came into this building with an overhead. And people, they'd move. So as a song, the slide would go up so you could see the lyrics. They'd be moving it down. And well, 1 year later, that brother, he was gone. He's gone. That church never flew. And here we are still fighting it out. Martin, go back to the last slide if you would. My point is, this is real world stuff. People plant and develop and grow churches in the American context based on they want to be in white areas of high education, high economics, low minorities in the area, etc., and median household income. What this chart shows is the average size of churches based on median household income. And of course, don't worry about the numbers, but the point is the more income in your church, average income of the household, the bigger your church is. Now, I show all that to you to say this. We have a biblical and a noble and a worthy vision, but it is very difficult to live out in the American context because the American church is driven more by consumerism than it is by cause. And people attend church more because it's convenient and comfortable than it is for the sake of Christ and mission. And so anyone who's a part of this church, God bless you for saying it's not about me. It's about him and it's about us. What could God do through us? Could we change the world, beginning with our community? And as you know, we're having tremendous impact in that regard. So with all that as a backdrop, what I realize is we can't control what we don't have, right? So would I like a great facility and great, of course. Don't you want that? I want a nice facility, clean and safe, secure for our children. Don't you want that? I want that. Wouldn't you like a little bit more money in this church so we weren't always having to worry about how we're going to pay payroll and pay the bills? I'd like all that. There's nothing wrong with that, right? I want that. That'd be great. And maybe this church will develop to that point someday. And I think we're on our way. I really, really do. My point is, we can't control all that stuff. What we can control is our relationships. So we can do that whether you got money or not. We can do that whether you have a facility or not. We can control, as it were, as a church, we can will ourselves that which we do have, which is one another. Does that make sense? And to will ourselves into relationship outside of Sunday morning is what not only sustains the mission, but it's where you find God and you experience God and you recognize him and you learn to love him and trust him more and you dare to risk yourself in the context of communitas. Relationships. We find God, trust him in new ways, and see and ask and dare to ask and dream the question, I wonder what God could do through us. So this series is focused on this term called communitas, which is very different than community. And when we think about small groups, let's say, or getting together outside of a church, typically we think of small groups or community life, all right? Communitas is actually a Latin term, and it takes it beyond simple community, because community in and of itself, in a sense, fosters this idea of security and safety and convenience and comfort and kind of our little club. Communitas is all that, but it's actually more. In fact, defined in a general way, communitas is a term that conveys shared adventure, shared risk, common mission, and fulfilling reward. Shared adventure, shared risk, common mission, and fulfilling reward. That's more in the term communitas than it is community. It's defined in some sites as this: an intense community spirit, and it's not talking about the community out here, it's talking about a fellowship, a small group, as it were, real relationships with a handful of individuals. An intense community spirit, the feeling of great social equality, solidarity, and togetherness. Social equality, solidarity, and togetherness. A sense of shared community spirit, adventure, risk, common mission. Now, to help us further understand this, which is just my task today to kind of help us understand this idea of communitas and where we're moving the church this month and the next, we're using some of the writing and understanding of a friend of mine named Alan Hirsch. And this is a book, I don't know if you see it here, but it's called On the Verge. Now, this book was written several years ago, and it documents the movement towards missional community and or communitas in the American church, and is really pushing the American church beyond comfort and convenience. And Alan and Dave, the co-authors, are friends of mine. In fact, I had the privilege of representing you as a part of a 2-year journey with the people, with this group, and there's 12 churches featured in this book, and our church is one, like on that edge. And so it tells all this philosophy and thought about the things we're talking about, but then lists 12 churches, talks about the 12 churches. We actually we met in New York, we met in San Francisco, we journeyed together for a 2-year period to think about these things collectively. And of course, our church, My Voice, most of the room is like people that got churches like 15,000 people, 18,000 people. One guy had 18 campuses and 30 Sunday services. And then there's me. Boy, and they're all friends of mine, but I just kept, sometimes it's a lot of talk and not a lot of mission, So I'm their champion, the multi-ethnic voice, and the mission of community, etc. But anyways, good friends of mine. But Alan is from New Zealand, a Kiwi, if you know that part of the world, right? He's a Kiwi from New Zealand, and a little bit hard to understand because of his accent. A great thinker, and he's really challenged the American church on this idea of becoming missional and what that means. And Communitas is a part of being missional. And just in a big nutshell, and I want you to see this video, he and others have gone to the mega churches in this country and said, you are more like country clubs than you are about cause. And he's found some acceptance in that. Now, past all that is My Voice. In fact, Alan told me about 3 years ago, you're 6 years behind me in terms of movement. So the multi-ethnic church movement is behind the missional movement, and why it's coming is because you can't actually live out being a missional church without being diverse and reflecting your community. But the American church doesn't realize that yet, but they're realizing it. Does that make sense? But Alan's is the missional movement and the voice. So take a look at this video. It explains this idea of Communitas from my good friend Alan Hirsch. Listen, they put some words up. His accent's thick. We're going to turn up the volume, and we'll try to summarize after you see Alan Hirsch on the concept of Communitas.
And then we have Communitas, which is the final piece. Communitas is a community formed in the context of an ordeal, a challenge, a task, a mission that requires each player to find each other in a new significant way to get the job done. Friends become comrades, team players. All movements that change the world seem to have a comradeship and a sense of each other's backs that we tend to lack in Western expressions of church. If you aim for ministry, you never get to mission, even if you intend to do it. However, if you aim at mission, you get ministry as well, because ministry is the means by which you do mission. If you organize and rally around the flag of mission, that is what we do outside of the church, in Jesus' name, you have to do ministry along the way, because ministry is the means by which you must do mission. In other words, you have to be loving, you have to be serving, you have to do it together in order to actually achieve your mission, because you're not going to achieve it otherwise. So Communitas takes place along the way of trying to do something that requires that we learn to love each other in a deep and more profound way as a group of brothers and sisters who rely on each other very deeply and are very disappointed when someone maybe doesn't fulfill their task within a given framework, because we really do need each other to survive. I do think that Christians are very risk-averse, and churches are very, very risk-averse. They are not places that you normally associate with adventure or risk or creativity. Because here's the deal, if you want to be creative, you have to risk failure. If you want to achieve something beyond the status quo, you have to get out of the status quo, which means you're not going to make everyone happy. But the problem is, without that, you never go anywhere. And so you're stuck with the stifling status quo, which I think is what many churches are stuck in, because we've cultivated this kind of safety awareness, this middle-class obsession with safety and security. I'm afraid that will kill us in the end. A little bit of danger is good for us, a risk. It doesn't always have to be death-defying. Doing a job that pushes us out of our comfort zones is very good for us. I think that in America, we self-identify as largely a middle-class society. And like I said, there's nothing evil about being middle-class, but one of the bad things about middle-class culture is its obsession with safety and security, comfort and convenience, right? There's no question about that. That's the bad side. It's this need to kind of secure the kids, But when that becomes obsessive, it's dangerous to the gospel, because it attenuates the gospel, because the gospel calls that into question. So what we do is we have to resolve the tension, and we usually do it in the name of the family. So the gospel becomes this kind of civil religion that really just affirms my lifestyle. So I think that what a middle-class America, therefore a middle-class church, easily co-opts Christianity to be the civil religion. And it's really the country club atmosphere, no threat. It's just nice, safe, it's just part of my world. It's my religious aspect of my world, but I don't experience adventure or journey or quest over there at all. But real adventure, real journey, real quest, where we're stakeholders in the outcome, where our bodies are on the line, I don't think so. It doesn't happen very often. It's good for us. If it doesn't kill you, it's going to make you a lot stronger, but it could kill you. Let's acknowledge that. But you don't have to be that far out where it's like a death-defying, but I think you've got to put yourself out a little bit. But the wonderful thing is you'll learn and you'll find Jesus in new ways, and you'll learn to trust God in new ways too. And let's see what God can do through us.
Good. So we were saying earlier, we can't control as a church what we don't have. But what we want to control, as it were, we want to develop is what we can develop. And 2 or 3 years ago, when we got involved with Visioneering, who are the architects of our future facility across the street, one of the big aha moments for us as a church is that we spent the first 10 years of the church focused on mission, and which is great. But what we realized is 10 years into the journey, we were 80% a mission and 20% a church. And what happens when that is that you can't sustain the mission long term unless we balance the community or communitas with the mission. It's just like trying to fight a war when you have weak supply lines. If your soldiers can't eat, if there's not a good convoy and a steady of ammunition or whatever, you can't win that war. You can't sustain the front line. Do you see what I'm saying? And so in the first 10 years of our church, we're 80% a mission, 20% a church. So what I mean by that is we didn't really concentrate on facilities or a strong children's program or a variety of things. And the people that were not only attracted here but stayed here were people who gave up all of that, otherwise the convenient comfort of traditional church, to serve this community, to make an impact in a big, big way. Not just write a check here or there, but actually invest themselves and live here. But again, we realized we can't sustain that, and what would happen is we had this isn't accurate numbers, but you have the 20% zealots just totally devoted to Mosaic, to that cause. 20% of people don't want anything to do with it, right? And then you have this group in the middle that come and they come and they stay for a year, they stay for 2 years. But at some point, even though they're good-hearted people, love the Lord, want to be involved, there just wasn't enough undergirding for them on the church side. Does that make sense? And that was a real aha moment for us as a church. Because we don't want to lose those folks in the middle who otherwise have good hearts, would be here, but they need a little bit more for their children, a little bit more for us. And that's not in a selfish way. That's, again, balancing mission and church to sustain it long term. So 2 to 3 years ago, we began to make moves towards this and saw it as a 10-year process. Because establishing a church long term in a community isn't about me or who the current leaders is. You have to think in the future. So we're on a 10-year journey, 3 years into it, to balance church and mission. And so, among other things, back in the day, we moved Mike Clowers and gave him a different role to help strengthen infrastructure. And we've done some things behind the scenes, kind of like building a church or a house where you're doing foundational work, but nobody really sees, but later on it pays benefit. And on I could go. But the piece that we're putting in this month and next month is one we've been working towards for about 9 months. And it's this idea of communitas, but in the colloquial term of the American church, it's small groups. It's relational connections in communitas outside of Sunday mornings in the future. Can't control what we don't have in terms of assets, but what we have is better than a sound system or better than walls and a night. It's you. It's one another. And so what we can build then outside of Sunday morning, outside of the apostles' teaching, as it were, in prayer, is relationships so we can overcome the challenges of the difficulty of this missional community in an urban context with low economics, low education, on and on I could go, right? High minorities in the area. That's a challenge. But it's a worthy one. No one's right where Christ would be. And that's why I want to be here. But we can build relationships so that we can overcome those challenges that we showed you statistically. We can sustain the mission, experience real reconciliation, and ultimately impact our culture on this very thing. And so the piece that we're moving towards to put into place then is this idea of getting every single member in this church. If this is your church and you're a part of it and this is your home and you're on mission, we all need to connect authentically, transparently, etc., in real relationships through community, through small groups, as it were. But again, we're not just pitching the typical small group. What you heard Alan talk about is this idea, again, of communitas, right? And so it's this idea of an intense spirit for one another, a feeling of great social equality, solidarity, and togetherness. The feeling that if you don't come through for someone else, everything fails. The feeling that we got each other's back. The feeling that we know each other and we're living on a common mission. That really can't be fleshed out simply on a Sunday morning. And to strengthen our church, connections, community as it were, and to sustain this great, worthy, noble, biblical vision long term, we can't just be content with what's happening on a Sunday morning. We've got to get into each other's lives, support each other's lives, and love and serve and give to one another in communitas for the sake of Christ and cause. So what Alan was saying is this: what happens when you approach and you gift yourself to others in such a way as communitas? Well, we gain, as he said, and foster a sense of shared mission. So you're not just listening to Mark, for instance, espouse the mission of the collective church. You experience shared mission when you break it down and talk about, maybe even the sermon in a small group this week, and you talk about it, you apply it, you find God, you trust God, and you see what God might do through us. You find your needs met in one another, right? That you can't let each other down. In other words, in the future, you don't call the church when someone's sick and ask the church to meet the need. You see what I'm saying? We're too big for that, and it's not even how it should be done. It's not an institution, that we send out some, the idea is like if you're in a small group, 10, 12 people, and somebody's sick, who rallies around? That group. They love one another. They serve one another. The leaders of that group are really the pastors of those people, right? The apostles weren't pastoring so much. They were empowering lay leadership in the church to be the real servants and leaders. Not that I don't want to do it, but you know what I'm saying? You've got to have people investing in life online. So through Communitas, we meet one another's needs, and you realize that if you don't come through, somebody's let down. And that moves you beyond comfort. That gives you cause and place and mission. And you don't get that just on a Sunday. We find or run headlong into risk. Remember what he talked about? We don't run from risk. That's why the American church and middle class America, which I'm a part of, it's so adverse to risk. Because what happens when you risk? You can lose. You can lose what you have. You'll lose your friends. People don't understand, on and on. We experience when we avoid risk. But rather, the gospel requires us to run to risk. And to not be content with status quo, but to be a threat. I've never thought about it until I was thinking about what Alan says, but that's what our mission is. It's a threat. Our vision is a threat to the status quo. But it's biblical and godly, and it's going to win whether you like it or not, because this is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is not segregated. Therefore, the local church on earth should not be either. So we run to risk, and we become a godly threat to otherwise status quo. We throw off the shackles of that status quo. We do, through Communitas, a job outside of our comfort zones, and we find, as Alan said, it's good for us. It's good for us. We don't put comfort and convenience above Christ, cause, and church. And through Communitas, we understand ourselves as stakeholders, as investors together, like a mutual fund. We're all in it together. You're a stakeholder. And you realize in Communitas, different than listening to me or Anthony or Harry, whatever, on a Sunday morning, you realize that the outcome of our mission and vision depends not on Mark, but on you. All of this depends on you, and it depends on us. And you don't feel that on a Sunday morning, but you will feel it in Communitas. And so the outcome of this 5-week series is to move every member of this church, if this is your church and this is your home, into Communitas, or again, colloquially, small groups, which we're calling circles, by the way. Not just to help us realize it's not a small group, more community. So circles is what we'll be calling. And over the next few weeks, Anthony, Harry, Mike will be talking about what those circles involve, how it fleshes out in the life of our church, and ultimately getting you on board, both in terms of involvement in it as well as leaders. And we have as a goal, we really like to see 80% or more of this church in those. I mean, 100% need to be in it, but I know that sometimes there's circumstances. But we really want to see 80% of this church active and involved in one another's life through circles in the days to come. Another thing is we want to empower younger leaders. The future of this church depends on younger people being able to step up and pastor and lead. And I'm not just talking about being a paid pastor, as it were. I'm talking about leading as a lay member. And the best training ground for that, the best proving ground for that, is as a leader in a small group. Because when you lead a circle and you have 12 people, you're their pastor. And we're going to empower you to do that. We've written on it. We're going to train, all that. But you feel what it's like to have to invest in the lives of other people and not just sit next to them on a Sunday morning. And you feel what it's like to give yourself and to sacrifice and to serve. And you find fulfillment in that. So moving 80% of the church into small groups by September, right? Empowering younger leaders to be the pastors in this church. And of course, and I could go on, we'll quit right here, but the idea, through all this then, we balance church and mission. Do you understand that? And by balancing the church life with the missional life of our church, we sustain that mission long term, longer than I would be around, or maybe some of you who are my age and older would be around, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of community. Just like Alan has had impact on the American church, as I try to tell you from time to time, just so you know, or even as seen in things like this book, this church, us together, is impacting the American church. The American church on the multi-ethnic issue looks to this church unlike any other. And there's a lot of them. But they are watching you, and many don't want you to succeed. I don't think you heard me. Many do not want us to succeed. But increasingly, people are buying in. And it's changing the very face and the credibility of the American church. And so I'll leave you with this thought from the book. When they studied our church and all this, and of course, you know, again, I told you some of the kind of churches that I was involved with here. Great people. I love them all. We're good friends. But they talk about the challenges to the worthy, noble mission and vision that we're on. So there were 5, and here's the first one. They said, here's a challenge, sacrifice. They, meaning Mosaics, people, you, me, they have witnessed the struggle to embrace suffering over comfort. Isn't that interesting? They look at us and they see a group of people, the American church sees a group of people that is willing to embrace suffering over comfort. Understanding privilege. It's important that some first recognize a privileged past in order to move beyond the colonial type mentality of helping those people. They see that we are moving beyond colonial past, and we don't see those people as those people, they as us. And we are one. Trust. As they seek to be missional and multi-ethnic, they have found that trust is built more slowly over time when they engage others different from themselves. Humility. It is difficult for some to believe that their way is just one way to do something at any given moment and not always the way to do something. And lastly, economics. A healthy multi-ethnic church is economically diverse, and this has made the church more dependent on God and others to supplement their annual budget. We're dependent. We can't control what we can't control, but we have the greatest asset of any church, and I'd go to war with this group of people, you, more than any church I've ever been a part of 31 years. We got the greatest asset. It's you and your heart for the vision of this church and for Christ. Now, the challenge is let's get beyond the pew and into the lives of people, one another, this fall as we move ourselves into real, authentic relationships of transparency and trust through circles, becoming a leader, becoming involved in Communitas. Let us pray. Father, thank you for the challenge of your word, finding you in the context of relationship beyond the pageantry of a Sunday morning, beyond the programs, beyond a screen and a sound system, involved in one another's lives, loving, serving, giving, sacrificing, finding you in the midst, trusting you more in the midst, growing in you more in the midst, and dare to ask the question, let's see what God can do through us. I pray, Lord, you help our church take up this collective challenge and strengthen the church side so we can sustain the mission long term. We pray in Jesus' name.